Close your eyes for a moment and let your imagination guide you. We are several centuries ago in the heart of the Middle Ages in a Europe that is still wild, where nature imposes its rhythm on men, and where winter is more than a season. It is an ordeal, a terrible ordeal, icy, almost crushing. Night fell long ago, much earlier than today, for the days are short and light scarce. The sun, weak and pale, offered only a few hours of respite before disappearing below the horizon. Now the cold reigns supreme. The wind blows through the bare branches of the trees, rushes between the thatched roofs, and moans like a distant complaint. The snow crunches underfoot, and each breath produces a white cloud that immediately evaporates into the icy air. In a small house made of wood and mud, a fireplace struggles against the darkness. Smoke escapes through a rough opening, perfuming the air with the acrid smell of burning wood. The walls sometimes tremble in the gusts, and the tiles or bales of straw covering the roof creak, as if the house itself were suffering from the cold. Inside, a peasant family has gathered around the fire. Their faces are lit by the flickering flames, their shadows cast on the uneven walls, and their slow movements are evident. They wear several layers of coarse, thick woolen clothing, but despite this, the cold seeps into their feet, their hands, even their bones. We sit together to keep warm, we hold the children close, and we wait. Wait for the night to pass. Wait for spring to return. Wait always. And then a question gently echoes in your mind, almost like a whisper. How did these men and women survive such merciless winters? Without modern heating, without electricity to light the night, without supermarkets stocked with food, without thick, warm blankets. How were they able to resist, year after year, the cold, the hunger, the fear of winter? This is the journey I am offering you. A calm and soothing journey that will take us to meet these medieval peasants, their humble homes, their precious reserves, their habits and their hopes. Together we will understand how, despite the deprivations, despite the dangers, despite the harshness of their existence, they found the means to hold on. Make yourself comfortable. Let the wind blow away. And let me tell you the story of slow, stubborn survival in the freezing winters of the Middle Ages. Snowflake, the climate and challenges of medieval winter. Imagine Europe several centuries ago. No paved roads, no illuminated towns, no electrically heated houses. Instead, vast expanses of dark forests, snow-covered plains, and isolated villages, lost in the icy whiteness of the countryside. Winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season to be endured in sweaters and central heating. It was an implacable force, a trial that brought the poorest to their knees and spared even the powerful. The days were short, with barely a few hours of daylight before night swallowed the world. The sun, when it appeared, provided little more warmth than a candle flame in a cathedral. The cold seeped in everywhere, into the cracks of houses, into worn clothing, even into bones. Every breath became visible, every breath escaped in white swirls, as if the air itself refused to be contained. Hands, constantly exposed, cracked, turned red then blue, sometimes numb. Feet, plunged into snow or frozen mud, lost all warmth. Some, the most unfortunate, suffered from frostbite, those invisible bites that nibbled at extremities without warning. In the fields, winter was taking its toll. The land, fertile in spring, was becoming as hard as stone. The seeds waited for better days, buried in the cold earth. Nothing grew, nothing could be harvested. The work of the land, usually so noisy and lively, gave way to an oppressive silence, broken only by the wind whistling between the hedges. Animals suffered too. Cows, sheep, and horses, essential to the survival of families, needed protection. They were sheltered in low, poorly ventilated stables, warmer than the fields. There, the strong smell of damp straw, manure, and huddled animals filled the air, while body heat barely maintained a fragile warmth. Yet, despite efforts, many animals died during the winter, from cold, disease, or starvation, due to lack of sufficient fodder. Every lost animal was a tragedy because it meant less milk, less meat, less strength to plow in the spring. Isolation was also a factor. Villages, already far apart, became almost inaccessible when snow covered the paths. The roads, simple muddy trails, disappeared under the ice. Crossing a few kilometers could become a dangerous expedition, especially if one risked getting lost in a storm or encountering hungry wolves. So people stayed at home, withdrawn into their immediate community, sometimes for weeks on end. The cold, the night, and the isolation wove together a unique, heavy, almost stifling atmosphere. People lived to the rhythm of fire and light, as if each ember was a promise of survival. Each crackle of the wood was a comfort, each flame a victory against the darkness. But behind this fragile warmth, fear never completely disappeared. For everyone knew that winter was not just a season to endure. It was a silent struggle, a daily fight to stay alive. The climate and challenges of medieval winter. The nights of medieval winter seemed eternal. Imagine yourself in a small village, deep in the heart of a frozen plain. The sun sets early, long before the daily chores are completed. Barely a few hours of daylight have passed before darkness envelopes everything, like a thick black blanket. No streetlights, no electric lights on the horizon. Only the faint glow of candles, the fireplace, or sometimes the moon, is enough to pierce the night. These endless nights carried an immense psychological weight. The silence was sometimes oppressive, broken only by the creaking of wood in the hearth, or the howl of an icy wind rushing through the cracks. For many, the night became a space of anxiety. They feared spirits, thieves, wolves. But more than anything, they feared the uncertainty of tomorrow. How much wood was left to last? How much food was left to feed the family? How many animals would survive until spring? And when the sky filled with heavy clouds, it wasn't just snow that fell. The insidious, icy rains transformed the paths into veritable traps. The ground, already saturated with moisture, became a thick, sticky mud, slowing down every step. The peasants, sometimes forced to go out to feed their animals or look for wood, sank their feet into this soggy earth. The cold bit into their ankles and legs, and water seeped into their rudimentary leather or cloth shoes, which were difficult to dry. Once wet, it was almost impossible to regain warmth. Thus, every chore became a struggle, and every exit from the house an additional danger. Then came the snowstorms. Imagine the gusts of wind hitting a thatched roof, the white swirls erasing the paths, the houses almost disappearing under the thick snowflakes. In this silent chaos, it became impossible to distinguish the horizon. The villages found themselves cut off from the world as if buried. Anxiety rose. Would we survive until the sky calmed down? Inside the houses, doors were reinforced, cracks in the walls were stuffed with straw, and children were crammed under wool blankets. Yet even so, the cold always found an opening. The warmth of the hearth fought valiantly, but it barely reached a few feet around the flames. Farther away, near the walls, ice sometimes formed, forming fine crystals that reflected the flickering light. And outside, the animals suffered from these storms too. The roofs of the stables grew heavy under the weight of the snow, sometimes threatening to collapse. They had to shovel them away again and again under a raging sky, their hands numb, their faces whipped by ice. Every moment outside was a sting, but giving up meant losing the animals and with them losing a chance of survival. These dreaded storms transformed villages into besieged fortresses. People withdrew, shut themselves in, and waited. Waiting became the greatest of virtues and also the heaviest of trials. Snowflake, the climate and challenges of medieval winter. When winter set in for long months, it wasn't just the cold that tormented the peasants. Hunger, insidious and persistent, became a daily companion. At the beginning of the season, everyone was reassured by looking at the reserves piled up in the attics. Sacks of grain, root vegetables, a little salted or dried meat, a few hard cheeses. But week after week, the sacks dwindled, the jars emptied. Each portion was measured carefully, the bread was cut into thinner pieces. The same soup was boiled again and again until it contained little more than hot water flavored with a few leftovers. For the poorest, winter almost always meant a form of famine. People sometimes gathered dry herbs under the snow, searched for forgotten roots and hoped to find game, but hunting was not open to everyone. It was reserved for lords and their men. Attempting to poach could cost one's life, and yet many took the risk, driven by the empty stomachs of their children. Isolation made this famine even harder to bear. In the villages, frequent trade was hard to count on. Markets, so lively in spring and summer, almost disappeared in winter. The roads, transformed into frozen mud or buried under snow, prevented merchants from moving around. So, each family lived with what they had prepared in the fall. The villages became closed worlds, withdrawn into themselves, each counting their meager resources and hoping to hold out until the snow melted. This isolation wasn't just physical. It weighed on people's minds. When the days were reduced to a few hours of light, when the evenings stretched endlessly in a dark and damp house, weariness took hold of people's hearts. People talked less and worked on repetitive tasks like repairing tools, spinning wool, and braiding rope, but always in the same oppressive atmosphere. Melancholy became a companion almost as heavy as the cold. The older ones, sitting by the hearth, told stories and legends to while away the hours. The children sometimes played, but soon overtaken by fatigue, they fell asleep huddled together. Time seemed to stand still. The days no longer passed. They slipped by slowly, drop by drop, like water seeping through leaky roofs. And still in people's minds a dull fear. What if the reserves were not enough? What if the snow took a long time to melt? What if another storm shut the village in? In this climate of uncertainty, faith and solidarity were fragile but indispensable ramparts. Sheaf of rice, food and supplies. If the cold bit the bodies and slowed down movements, it was hunger that haunted the minds. For surviving the medieval winter was not only about finding warmth, it was also about preserving every piece of food, every grain, every vegetable, as if each contained a promise of survival. As summer drew to a close, farmers were busy in the fields. The harvest wasn't just a celebration of abundance, it was a struggle against time. The harvested grain had to be dried, sorted, threshed, and then carefully stored. It was placed in granaries or silos, sometimes dug into the ground, protected by clay or thick planks. But even so, the danger remained constant. Humidity, mice, and rats could destroy an entire season's efforts in a matter of weeks. Bread, the central staple of the Middle Ages, depended on this grain. But unlike the golden image of our modern loaves, peasant bread was dark, heavy, often mixed with rye, barley, oats, and sometimes even bark or crushed acorns in times of shortage. This rough, black bread formed the basis of every meal. It was dipped in soup to soften it and shared equally around the table. It was not just food, it was a symbol of survival. Alongside grain, vegetables had to be considered. In the gardens, cabbage, turnips, beans, and peas were grown. They were eaten fresh until autumn, but winter required a different approach. So they were dried, preserved in sand, or stored in cool cellars, protected from the light. Each turnip, each cabbage became a treasure that had to be kept for as long as possible. Meat, rare and precious, could not be left to chance. When an animal was slaughtered, often as winter approached, since it was expensive to feed all the animals during the cold season, nothing was wasted. The meat was salted, rubbed with salt to prevent decomposition. Sometimes it was hung over the hearth, in the smoke that blackened the beams of the house, to preserve it longer. The taste became bitter, but it prolonged the life of the reserves. In these houses where everything had to be designed to last, the smallest gesture was important. A tightly closed jar of dried beans, a bag of flour kept safe from animals, a piece of bacon hanging from the beams. Each of these details could make the difference between a bearable winter and a deadly famine. And every evening when the family gathered around the fire, a small portion of these reserves was taken out. A thick soup, made of water and dried vegetables, sometimes enriched with a little fat or bacon, simmered for a long time in an earthenware pot. It diffused a simple, almost monotonous, but comforting smell throughout the house. The meal was modest and repetitive, but it provided the warmth needed to face the freezing night. Sheaf of rice, food and supplies. Winter forgave no mistakes. Every meal had to be designed to nourish and warm the body tired by the cold and work. Thick soups were central to daily life. They were prepared in large earthenware or iron pots, suspended over the fire. The water boiled for a long time before adding root vegetables, dried legumes, and sometimes a few pieces of bacon or animal fat. These soups gave off a warm, comforting aroma that pervaded the entire house, blending the earthy scent of cabbage with the smoky notes of meat. Cabbage, the king of winter vegetables, was eaten in all its forms, boiled, fermented, and sometimes chopped to enrich porridges. Turnips and broad beans, less noble but more hearty, supplemented these monotonous meals. Dried herbs were sometimes added, if luck had allowed a few handfuls to be preserved. Each bowl served was small but precious, and care had to be taken to ensure that everyone received their share, as shortages always affected the most vulnerable, children and the elderly. Domestic animals played a crucial role. Cows provided milk, which was used to make cheese or enrich porridge. Chickens provided eggs, which were few in number but essential for adding variety to the diet. Sometimes an animal was slaughtered in the middle of winter to feed the family, and nothing went to waste. The blood was used to thicken porridge, the bones were boiled to make a mineral-rich broth, and the hides were tanned or used for leather. Black bread remained the cornerstone of every meal. Dipped in soup or eaten with a little cheese or bacon, it provided the energy needed to face long days. It was shared with care, and its rarity reinforced the sense of solidarity among family members. Each bite became almost a conscious act of survival. But despite all these precautions, periods of famine were frequent. Particularly long winters or poor harvests led to a decrease in reserves. Families then had to ration even more strictly. 1 meal a day, water and flour porridge for the youngest, and the constant worry of running out before the arrival of spring. In these moments, daily life became a careful dance between effort and patience. Every action had vital importance. Fetching water, feeding the animals, checking supplies, cooking. Everything became ritualized, almost hypnotic, as if the repetition of these simple acts could ward off hunger and cold. Winter survival was thus a delicate balance. Between caring for food, preparing meals, and constantly tending to animals, each farmer lived in a gentle but persistent tension. The cold and scarcity forced vigilance, caution, but also creativity, because sometimes a forgotten root, a miraculously preserved egg, or a handful of hidden grains could save a family. Hammer and wrench work in daily survival. When the cold sets in and snow covers the fields and paths, the rhythm of peasant life changes, but it never stops. The long winter days are not filled with sowing or harvesting, but with another kind of work, slower and more meticulous. The cold forces the peasants to stay close to their homes, sheltered from the icy wind, and yet the body must remain in motion to survive. Farm tools require special attention. Plows, hoes, and scythes must be cleaned, repaired, and sharpened for the next season. Every nail, every cord becomes precious. Maintaining work tools is an almost meditative ritual. The friction of metal against the whetstone, the sharp sound of planks being adjusted, the metallic scent of heated steel. These gestures, repeated tirelessly, are both a necessity and a way to maintain a connection with active life, despite the isolation of winter. Domestic work then takes on its full importance. Spinning wool becomes a daily activity, the spinning wheels creaking gently in the silence of the house. The women, sitting by the fire, transform the fleece into soft threads, which are then woven to make clothes or blankets. These slow, repetitive gestures create an almost hypnotic atmosphere. The soft rustling of the wool, the scent of soot and smoke, the flickering light of the flames on the concentrated faces. Caring for domestic animals remains essential, even when the cold seems like it's about to put a stop to everything. In the stables, the cattle must be fed, hay distributed, and water scraped from the ice so the animals can drink. The flock of chickens, pigs, cows, and sometimes horses require constant attention. A sick or neglected animal can jeopardize the survival of the entire family. The gestures are precise and gentle, imbued with patience, because each animal is a source of food, warmth, and sustenance for the months to come. Even in winter, certain obligations to the Lord did not disappear. Corvées, roadwork, bridge maintenance, repairs to castle or village walls, could continue despite the cold. They were less frequent, but the threat of punishment or reprisals forced peasants to rise early and move in the icy wind, bundled up in scanty clothing. These chores reinforced the sense of constant effort. Survival was not limited to the home. It also involved respecting social ties and feudal obligations. The long winter evenings become the setting for a slower, more intimate life. Families gather around the fire to share a modest meal, but also to listen to or tell stories, sing ancient songs, or pray. These evening gatherings are moments of rest, but also of learning and social connection. The sound of voices, the crackling of wood, the shadows of flames dancing on the earth or stone walls all contribute to creating a gentle and secure atmosphere. Even the simplest gestures take on a vital dimension. Knitting a garment, repairing a tool, feeding an animal, telling a story, everything becomes an act of survival. The slowness of these winter days, the repetition of tasks, the rhythm imposed by the darkness and the cold, give the peasants a silent endurance, a discreet but tenacious resistance. The distribution of work during the day and the winter week was not left to chance. Every action had its place, every hour its purpose. In the morning, before the cold reached its peak, people went to feed the animals and check that the water was not frozen. The low sun brought only a few hours of daylight, and it was necessary to take advantage of this to accomplish tasks requiring relative brightness. Repairing a tool, sawing wood for the fire, spinning a little wool. Children, as soon as they were old enough to walk and carry small loads, participated in domestic chores. They stoked the fire, gathered wood, helped feed the animals, or sorted vegetables. Women managed several activities simultaneously. They watched the younger ones, prepared meals, spun wool, or sewed clothes. These simple games developed their imagination and patience, but also their ability to observe and reproduce the actions of adults, essential for their future role in family survival. The evening gatherings also served a practical purpose. They allowed for the repair of clothing, the spinning of wool, the weaving of blankets, and the preparation of tools for the days ahead. Each gesture, however discreet, contributed to the safety and comfort of the family. Work and leisure blended into a harmonious rhythm, where the slow pace imposed by winter transformed each activity into an almost meditative ritual. Finally, these moments of gathering provided a psychological refuge. Cold, scarcity, and isolation could take their toll, but stories, songs, and the company of loved ones provided a sense of security and continuity. Life could be hard, but sharing these moments made survival more bearable, almost sweet. Thus, even in the depths of medieval winter, life was not limited to material survival. Vigils, games, music, and storytelling constituted a survival of the soul, a means of preserving joy, curiosity, and family and community cohesion. In the dancing light of the fire, peasants faced the night, the cold, and hunger with resilience, patience, and creativity. Snowflaked winter survival and resilience strategies. Over the generations, medieval peasants developed ingenious strategies to cope with harsh winters. Each family learned to anticipate scarcity, optimize its resources, and protect its loved ones from cold, hunger, and disease. Preparation was meticulous and began well before the arrival of the snow. The first rule was to build up reserves. Grains were carefully stored in silos or wooden chests, protected from moisture and rodents. Vegetables were dried, salted, or smoked, and fruits were preserved as compotes or purees. Meat, when available, was salted or smoked to last for several weeks. These preservation methods required patience and precision. Poorly dried grain or poorly salted meat could result in a valuable loss for the family. Protection against the cold came through housing and clothing. Houses, often small and thick, concentrated heat around a central hearth. Blankets, animal skins, and layered clothing were essential for retaining body heat. Everyday tasks, gathering wood, lighting the fire, maintaining the stables, were as much acts of survival as they were routine. Observation and adaptation to nature were also crucial. Peasants followed the cycles of winter, anticipated storms, and protected animals from the harsh cold. The fields were left to rest, but every task performed in the stables or around the hearth contributed to maintaining the balance of rural life. Even a simple application of salt to the animals or an addition of straw to their bedding could mean the difference between life and death. Resilience also involved mutual aid and collective rituals. Villages had unspoken rules of sharing, lending grain to a weakened family, helping to clear snow, or participating in the construction of a shed to protect crops. Prayers and religious rituals strengthened social cohesion and provided a sense of psychological security in the face of unpredictable weather and disease. Finally, resilience was a daily learning process. The mistakes of one winter served as a lesson for the next. The collective memory of families and villages transmitted know-how, tips, and prudent behavior. The evening gatherings, in addition to their social and recreational role, were a time when experience was shared, recounting how an animal had survived the frost, how a family had preserved its reserves, how a roof weakened by the snow had been repaired. These stories formed a practical and moral guide, strengthening the endurance of communities. Thus, surviving the medieval winter was not a matter of chance, but rather a combination of material preparation, social cohesion, and psychological resilience. Every snowflake, every icy breath of wind, every long silent night was faced with patience, ingenuity, and solidarity. And despite the apparent harshness of life, peasants managed to maintain not only their own existence, but also the warmth of family and community life, illuminated by fire and sharing. Handshake, solidarity, and mutual aid in the village. In medieval winters, individual survival was rarely possible without community support. Villages, though modest and sometimes isolated, functioned as protective networks where each family depended on the others. Sharing resources became vital: wood for fire, grain for bread, or even temporary shelter for those whose homes had been damaged by snow or wind. When the storm hit, collective actions were immediate and instinctive. Residents gathered to clear paths, clear driveways, or repair damaged roofs. The sound of shovels crunching through the snow, the muffled cries of children playing in the white piles, and the heavy breathing of adults in the icy air formed a quiet symphony of cooperation. Each shared effort strengthened bonds and lessened the burden of cold and isolation. Herds of animals were also central to this solidarity. Protecting animals was a collective matter, as milk, eggs, and sometimes meat depended directly on their survival. Peasants helped each other transport hay, shelter animals, and reinforce stables, and ensure that each animal received the necessary food and warmth. The actions were often simple, but when repeated and coordinated, they became essential for getting through the harshest months. Sharing fire and food was another expression of solidarity. In some villages, the most well-stocked households would temporarily accommodate those whose homes were insufficiently heated or whose supplies had run out. Meals could be shared, pieces of bread or cheese lent, and every gesture helped to strengthen cohesion and trust between neighbors. These exchanges, modest but constant, formed an invisible but solid safety net that protected the most vulnerable. Beyond material mutual aid, there was moral and psychological support. Collective vigils, prayers, and shared stories created a sense of community and belonging. In the flickering light of their homes, villagers recounted how a neighbor had survived a storm or how an animal had been saved thanks to collective aid. These stories, repeated from generation to generation, taught the importance of cooperation and strengthened resilience in the face of winter hardships. Thus, village solidarity was not just a moral or social choice, it was a survival imperative. The cold, the snow, and the long nights made individuals vulnerable, but together the peasants formed a protective network, capable of transforming the harshness of winter into a shared experience, where human warmth and mutual aid surpassed material difficulties. In this context, every snowflake, every icy breath of wind, and every long silent night was faced not alone, but with the certainty that the community, ever vigilant, ensured that no one remained isolated or lost in the still whiteness of winter. Let yourself be carried away by the medieval winter. As the wind continues to blow across the snow-covered rooftops and night shrouds the village in a veil of silence, one can almost feel the slow breathing of the frozen earth. Fires still crackle in the cottages, casting dancing shadows on the wood and stone walls, and the sweet smell of smoke mingles with that of black bread and dried herbs. The lives of medieval peasants, though harsh and sometimes cruel, were punctuated by these simple and essential moments: the warmth of a home, the sharing of a meal, the stories and songs that permeated the evenings. Every gesture, every ritual, every breath of winter contributed to material survival and the resilience of the soul. One can imagine families huddled together, children asleep by the fire, adults watching over animals, repairing tools, or spinning wool. The biting cold was never completely overcome, but it was tempered by solidarity, by the vigilance of neighbors, and by the slow, almost hypnotic routine that organized each day. Even the longest nights and harshest winters gave way to the beauty of shared life. The muffled sounds of the wind on the trees, the subtle crunch of snow underfoot, the clatter of utensils in humble kitchens. All these sounds composed a silent symphony, a gentle song that lulled the inhabitants and reminded them that every day, every effort and every act of mutual aid had meaning. So, by closing our eyes and letting these images and sensations gently sink into our minds, we understand why, despite the harshness of their existence, medieval peasants were able to survive. Their strength lay not only in their bodies, but in the intelligence of their preparation, in the warmth of their homes, and in the invisible wealth of their community. As the night draws on and the wind seems to slow, it is possible to be lulled by this story, to feel the slowness and depth of medieval life, and to recognize that resilience and human solidarity can make even the harshest of winters bearable. And so, in the hushed calm of the imagination, the snow continues to fall, the fire crackles gently, and life, even in the heart of medieval winter, continues its slow, peaceful, almost meditative rhythm. Sparkles religion, rituals and hope. In the silence of icy nights, when the wind made the trees shiver and snow gently covered the roofs of cottages, faith was for medieval peasants an invisible source of warmth. Prayers, whispered by candlelight or in the soft crackle of the hearth, were not just words. They were a breath of hope, a way to ward off hunger, cold, and disease. Every winter brought its own worries. Frost could damage grain reserves, snow could isolate villages, and disease could strike families. In these moments, prayer became a daily and intimate gesture. People prayed for good harvests, for the health of children and animals, and for protection from storms and epidemics. These prayers, repeated every night, structured time and offered a sense of control in the face of nature's unpredictability. The religious festivals of winter were bursts of light and warmth in the darkest months. Christmas, with its carols and symbolism of rebirth, brought a time of family and community gathering. Epiphany and Candlemas punctuated the cold weeks with celebrations where villages came together to share bread, stories, and songs. Church bells echoed through the snow, reminding residents that even in the harshness of winter, life went on and hope endured. Religion also provided a moral and social framework. It dictated behavior, organized festivals and rituals, and created a sense of belonging. Prayers and processions were not just obligations, they were moments of comfort, human contact, and consolation. In the silence of the snow or around a flickering fire, faith brought a serenity that contrasted with the harshness of daily life. In the depths of the cold nights, the religious ritual became almost hypnotic. The movement of the hands in the sign of the cross, the repetition of prayers, the scent of incense or wax, the modulated chants in low voices, all these elements created a gentle and reassuring atmosphere. Religion transformed anxiety into meditation, the cold into conscious attention, and solitude into communion with the village and the divine. Thus, amidst the icy winds and silent snow, faith offered medieval peasants not only spiritual guidance but also genuine psychological comfort. It enabled them to endure deprivation, to celebrate life despite everything, and to maintain the hope that, when the days grew longer and spring returned, nature and community would continue to thrive. In this wintry landscape, every bell, every song, every whispered prayer constituted an invisible thread of warmth and hope, connecting men and women to each other and to the world they sought to understand and soothe. Religion, rituals, and festivals were the luminous heart that beat gently in the center of winter, reminding us that even in the harshness of medieval life, hope and resilience remained alive. Surviving the medieval winter in slowness and light. As night spreads its silent cloak over the frozen fields and snow-covered rooftops, one can almost hear the breeze mingling with the crackling of fires in the cottages. Each falling snowflake transforms the landscape into a white, still, and peaceful setting, and yet, behind this tranquil beauty, the lives of medieval peasants continued with their efforts, their sorrows, and their discreet joys. Winter was long, the nights cold, and the snow sometimes so deep that it isolated villages from the rest of the world. But in this icy silence, human warmth was precious. Families huddled around fires, neighbors helped each other clear snow, repair roofs, or protect herds. Modest gestures of sharing, a piece of bread, a little firewood, a temporary shelter, became vital. Village solidarity formed an invisible network as strong as oak, capable of transforming the harshness of winter into a space of cooperation and comfort. Added to this material aid was the strength of faith. Daily prayers, the singing of religious festivals, and the flickering light of candles in churches brought a unique sense of calm. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, or simple vigils around the fire became moments of light, hope, and communion. Religion guided and reassured people, allowing them to endure the cold and hunger with a serenity that the body alone could not provide. Even winter chores and labors took on an almost meditative rhythm, repairing tools, weaving wool, tending animals. Each repetitive gesture, performed quietly and slowly, became a form of ritual, a means of surviving while finding a certain balance in the continuity of the seasons. Stories told by the fireside, whispered songs, and ancestral tales transmitted the memory of resilience, reinforcing the sense that, despite difficulties, life could endure and flourish. Thus, in the icy breath of the wind and the extended silence of snowy nights, medieval life unfolded at its slow and measured pace. The combination of solidarity, faith, and everyday gestures transformed the hostility of winter into a collective experience where each individual found warmth, comfort, and hope. The long nights seemed less harsh when one knew that neighbors were keeping watch, that songs and prayers warmed the soul, and that the community, united, faced trials together. And now, as we let these images, sounds, and sensations settle gently in our minds, we can almost feel the snow crunching underfoot, the fire crackling in the fireplace, and the scent of fresh bread and dried herbs. In this slowness, in this shared breath of life, lies the key to survival. A simple, attentive, and resilient humanity, capable of transforming cold and scarcity into a soothing, almost meditative rhythm, where human warmth and the light of faith illuminate even the darkest winters. And as the wind calms and the silence stretches, it is possible to surrender to this atmosphere, to feel the slow breathing of medieval life, and to understand that even in the harshness of winter, solidarity, hope, and faith are enough to keep men and women together, in an almost hypnotic gentleness. Snowflake, the dangers of medieval winter. When the first cold weather set in and the nights grew longer, medieval winter was more than just the quiet whiteness of the snow. For peasants, this season carried with it constant threats, silent but omnipresent. Every breath of icy wind seemed to remind us that life was becoming more fragile, and that survival depended as much on caution as on mutual aid and resilience. Famine was one of the most cruel ordeals. When fields froze, harvests dwindled, and grain reserves, often limited, could disappear faster than expected. Stored vegetables lost their freshness, and dried fruits and smoked or salted meats were not always enough to feed the entire family. Black bread, a staple food, sometimes became scarce, and thick soups were consumed sparingly. The anxiety of lack of food permeated every home, accompanied by the cold and silence of long winter evenings. The intense cold also aggravated illnesses. Respiratory infections, colds, and even tuberculosis or pneumonia could prove fatal, especially for children and the elderly. Injuries, already difficult to treat without modern care, became more serious when exposed to frost or when back or joint pain was complicated by exhaustion and hunger. Hypothermia struck the poorest, those whose clothing was thin, homes poorly heated, and blankets insufficient. Simply staying awake in a freezing cottage became a challenge, and each night represented a silent struggle to maintain body heat. Adding to this bodily fragility were domestic dangers. Timber and cob houses, heated by open fires, were vulnerable to accidental fires. An uncontrolled flame could turn a precarious shelter into a nightmare, leaving residents homeless in the depths of winter. Each home was therefore a delicate balance between warmth and caution, constant vigilance, and the effort to keep the flame alive. Finally, winter accentuated external threats. Isolated villages could be visited by hungry wolves or bandits, taking advantage of the harsh season to set traps. Frozen and snowy roads made travel perilous, limiting communication and the flow of information. Isolation was sometimes total, and dependence on the local community became vital. A neighbor, a relative, a stablemate could mean the difference between survival and loss. Yet despite these dangers, life went on. Peasants learned to anticipate the cold, to protect their families and possessions, to share what remained. Simple actions, feeding animals, chopping wood, preparing meals, became rituals of survival, each imbued with caution and care. And in this context of constant threat, every whispered prayer, every story told by the fireside, every song of religious festivals offered a breath of comfort, a fragile but persistent light in the darkness of winter. Thus, medieval winter was not just a season. It was a strict and patient teacher, revealing human vulnerability but also the strength of solidarity, the persistence of hope and resilience in the face of hardship. Every breath of icy wind, every crunch of snow underfoot, or every glimmer of light in the night bore witness to this silent, daily struggle for survival. Fire warmth and indoor comfort during the medieval winter. Despite the dangers and harshness of winter, medieval peasants knew how to create shelters where warmth and life could persist, even in the most modest homes. Every home, every daily gesture was designed to protect the body from the cold and preserve a little comfort in a world where resources were scarce. The heart of every cottage was the fire. A simple fireplace or open hearth became a center of life, diffusing warmth and light. Around this flame, families gathered to cook, weave, mend clothes, or simply talk. The crackling of wood and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, while shadows danced gently on the mud walls. Fire was more than a tool, it was a silent companion, a symbol of protection and life. Clothing, often made of wool and skins, was layered to maintain body heat. Thick socks, capes, and hats made by the locals' own hands provided a barrier against the biting cold. Blankets, straw mattresses, and woolen sheets transformed beds into almost comfortable refuges, where one could indulge in restful sleep despite the howling winds outside. House interiors were designed to limit drafts. Doors and windows were covered with boards or fabric, rooms were grouped together to concentrate heat, and pets sometimes slept inside to share their warmth. Simple actions, moving an armchair closer to the fire, wrapping a child in a blanket, checking that the wood was dry, became essential, almost meditative rituals that provided a sense of security and continuity. Food also played a role in domestic comfort. Thick soups, stews, and warm bread radiated a gentle warmth that warmed body and soul. Dried spices and herbs added familiar aromas, recalling life in milder seasons. Sharing these meals around the fire strengthened family and village bonds, creating an atmosphere of cohesion and comfort in an often unforgiving winter. Finally, songs, prayers, and stories told by the fireside created an invisible but equally essential warmth. Whispered or sung voices filled the air, guiding weary spirits to imaginary worlds or memories of abundant harvests, bright springs and summers. Faith and imagination became allies in combating the cold, giving meaning and continuity to daily life despite the icy nights. Thus, even in the harshest winters, medieval peasants found ways to create a cocoon of warmth and security. Every gesture, every object, every ritual helped transform the harshness of the season into an almost meditative experience, where body and mind could rest, nourish themselves, and continue to hope. In this inner calm, one can almost feel the gentle warmth of a fire, the smell of fresh bread, and the reassuring closeness of family and neighbors, reminding us that even in the face of winter's harshness, life persisted, humble but resilient. Survival, hope, and winter calm. As icy winds continue to blow through the medieval villages, snow covers the rooftops and night draws in, the peasants' lives never truly stop. Each day, each gesture, each breath becomes a delicate balance between danger and survival, between fatigue and heat, between fear and hope. One can imagine villages sleeping under a blanket of white, fireplaces casting a flickering light in the darkness, the crackling of wood mingling with the murmurs of the inhabitants. In every home, the flame is a symbol of life and resilience. Families, huddled together, share warmth and comfort, transmitting the silent courage that makes survival possible despite cold and hunger. Days pass, marked by rituals, prayers, and songs. Religious festivals bring a breath of light into the winter darkness, and stories told by the fireside warm minds as much as bodies. Even in the harshest of the season, village solidarity and mutual aid forge an invisible but vital bond, allowing men and women to continue together to get through the harshest months. Dangers remain: famine, disease, cold, fire, and external threats. But through these trials, medieval peasants discover the power of patience, ingenuity, and perseverance. Every loaf shared, every log added to the fire, every whispered prayer becomes a silent victory over the harshness of winter. Thus, by closing our eyes, we can almost feel the gentleness of everyday gestures, the warmth of the flame, the tranquility of the evenings, and the persistence of life amidst the snowy landscapes. The medieval winter, although brutal, reveals the beauty of human resilience, the power of the collective, and the importance of each calm and shared moment. And as the night deepens, the wind softens and sleep sets in, the listener can surrender to this winter calm, carried away by the slowness of the stories and the gentleness of the images, into a world where survival rhymes with patience, hope, and quiet intimacy. Throughout the long, icy months of the Middle Ages, medieval peasants displayed quiet resilience and impressive ingenuity. Every gesture, every precaution, every small victory against cold or hunger testified to a life where survival depended as much on skill as on solidarity and patience. They invented, repaired, shared, and found ways to create a little warmth and comfort in conditions we today would find hard to imagine. Their strength lies in the simplicity of their daily rituals. Gathering wood, feeding animals, preparing reserves, wrapping a child in a thick blanket. These gestures, repeated day after day, were all silent acts of protection and love. Village life, although harsh, was punctuated by solidarity, family, religion, and sharing, which provided a precious balance in the face of the harsh winter. When we think of them, it's almost impossible not to reflect on our modern comforts. We live surrounded by heat, light, a variety of foods, and accessible medical care. Yet, in this comfort, we sometimes forget the value of each simple act, the strength born of patience and community, and the beauty of an existence intimately connected to the rhythms of nature. And yet, despite the harshness of their world, medieval peasants knew how to create moments of calm and security. One can imagine them in the evening gathered around a crackling fire, the scent of hot soup floating in the air, the walls of the cottage offering a fragile but precious protection against the wind and snow. The flames danced gently, casting shifting shadows on faces, while the murmurs of prayers or stories soothed weary spirits. To close one's eyes and allow oneself to be carried away by this image is to rediscover the slow and meditative rhythm of those winter evenings, the human warmth, the light of the fire, and the relative security that collective work and vigilance brought. Even in the cold, the night, and the penury, life persisted, humble but strong, and the beauty of each small moment of comfort shone all the more brightly. So, as we conclude this exploration of the Middle Ages and the terrible winters that the peasants endured, we can be imbued with a sense of calm and gratitude. Life was hard, yes, but it was also full of courage, generosity, and little lights that made each night sweeter. And as the wind outside dies down, the snow lies silent, the soup steams and the fire crackles, we can fall asleep with the certainty that even in the face of life's rigors, human warmth, solidarity, and ingenuity make each winter bearable, and each night more peaceful than we could have ever imagined.